all sorts of problems. But to my great surprise, we got the money. One of the first ideas that I had when the subject came up was that obviously we had to work with ICAIC because I knew there was going to be lots of archive footage, mainly newsreel stuff, but a few other things as well. And so the notion of weaving the archive in and out throughout the film was there from the very beginning. I'm not quite sure what more to say just at this point, because part of the adventure of doing it was the same as the adventure of doing any documentary, which is that however you plan, things happen which you hadn't planned for. And things around you are changing. So just to give one tiny example of what that meant, even before we went, the stable genius in the White House started his anti-Cuban measures, and the image that I had in my mind of one of those big cruise liners in the harbor in Havana, I realized before we went that I wasn't going to get it, because there wouldn't be any anymore. And that was only the very beginning. So the shape of the film, although we scripted it, based on the research that Jean had done and that John had done, and with the cooperation of our informant stroke fixer stroke star from Caibarien, Pedri. I mean, all of that went into the planning, and as soon as we got there and hit the ground, things started to change, and the shape of the film is a response to that.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jean, for that introduction. I'm sure there's going to be lots of comments, lots of questions. It's such a rich and complex film, and it raises so many questions as well. So over to our conference delegates. Tony saying Marisa Wilson.
Hello, good morning. I really enjoyed that the second time around. And I'm really interested in this idea that, commodities can tell a story about social change and history and how places are integrated or not into the global economy. But the other side of that, I think, is also what is not taken out of the realm of commodification. So I think it would be interesting to just get your take, especially in terms of the local perspectives of people that you interacted with. I mean, a lot of what makes Cuba unique, I think, is that, for example, in the small farms or the larger farms that were there in the film, is a lot of the peasant farming is decommoditized, that people are producing inputs on the farm, and there are things, but there's a lot of contradictions as well within the Cuban economies. There's food that's designated for the tourist sector, which might be more commoditized, and then food that's perhaps given as gifts and things like that. So I'm just interested in the relationship between processes of commodification and processes of decommodification, or taking that out of the realm of commodification, and whether you found that people on the ground continue to support or continue to think that the Cuban project to preserve certain realms for gifts, or for for lack of a better way, for the non-economy, for something that's doesn't have a price. Is that something that, when I did research a long time ago, people of the older generation often did reaffirm those values on the ground? I'm wondering if you encountered that as well.
Wow. Shall I? that's a massive problem and a massive question and thought. On the commodification and decommodification, there's commodification and decommodification and anti-commodification possibly. Years ago, we were involved in a debate about commodities and anti-commodities, and to what extent, if in the local economy you're producing, the initial example was rice, that rice producers in Africa, in a sense, resisted the attempts to introduce the foreign rice, if you want, the white rice, and stuck to their own rice. Or another would be an example in Indonesia of bidi, or in India, bidi and kretek cigarettes versus the international ones that are coming in from the big corporations of the West. And of course, then you have another layer of, are they anti-commodities if they're actually sold locally, or if they're bartered, or if they're gifted? Does it make us any different? The debate goes on. I think every time I watch the documentary again, I think of all the different layers there. We did not anticipate going into depth about local agriculture. That wasn't on our horizon. We were thinking about the big commodities in Kaiwarien. And for all kinds of reasons in terms of the filming, we ended up not being able to do everything we wanted to do in Kaiwarien. So we then started thinking of other avenues. But they are also linked. And part of the problem of the grand project of the socialist project has been that the smaller parts are relegated. So the fact that right today you have, it has really impacted on me recently, that only 5% of investment was in agriculture last year. That in itself is a statement of where this whole commodity-driven development.
I'm sorry, I missed that. 5% of what? I didn't hear that. It cut off.
That part of the fact that last year only 5% of investment in agriculture
In Cuba, yeah.
in 2019, which is very shocking in a society and an economy that's trying to be more self-sufficient. And it's another statement of where Cuba finds itself as a product of its history, as a product of international global economy and politics, and especially the Trump administration. And people they're not going back to agriculture in droves, just as in this country when we had with the pandemic a call to go for volunteers for the National Health Service. 750,000 volunteered. Were the same numbers responding to the call to go and help in the agriculture? No. And that's the situation, one of the situations that Cuba finds itself in, and we all find ourselves in.
Yeah.
That's a long response to a long question. Sorry.
Thank you.
I don't have anything to add to that.
Well, I've put my hand up, Jean. I've put my hand up, so I'm going to ask both of you a question, which I guess is based. Thank you, Pedro. That could be the problem. We've had the same problem as well with Teams. So I was really struck. I love the film, and actually each time, it's the second time I've watched it, but each time I watch it, it says more. So that's fabulous. Each time it speaks more. But the question is, I'm really struck by the similarities between Kaiwarien and Manzanillo, which is one of the places that we know very well. And as much as you're talking about the failures of capitalism, colonialism, commodification, the failures of socialism, there's also something there which some of your interviewees talk about, and that's modernity, the failures of, or the impact of modernity, and particularly a place like Caibarien, with which you describe as being bourgeois, with a commercial past, but also a literary past. And I say this because when Tony and I were thinking about a project to look at literary culture outside Havana, one of our good friends in Cuba, who's no longer with us, Mercedes Santos Moraes, said, you need to go to Caibarien. They have such a vibrant literary culture. People enjoy literature in a way that I haven't seen in many other places. And the same is always said about Manzanillo. Manzanillo has a literary heritage in sort of cosmopolitan terms. So Garcia Lorca, etc., etc. You know, it was a center for that kind of activity in the 1930s. I'm not sure if there are other places in Cuba, but I think the coincidence of the port, maybe it's not a coincidence, port, commerce, bourgeois, urban, and a particular configuration of literary culture, and then a rivalry with a more conservative, traditional, inland place such as Remedios in your case and Bayamo in our case is just really, really striking. And if you look at the pictures, you know, the first time I saw the film, I said to Tony, that's Manzanillo. It's almost identical in terms of its architecture. So there isn't a question there, but I'm just thinking about the whole question of particular versions of modernity in the 19th century and their impact.
I guess I have a sort of half-formed response to that, which is that it's about something which isn't unique to Cuba. It's about the effects of, in a fairly small country, but it could be a larger country like Great Britain, of having a world city as the capital, and taking attention from cultural practices and activities and centres in other places in the country. What would make Cuba more distinctive in that respect, I guess, would be one of the things, for example, that isn't in the film is the paradas that take place in Remedios from the end of the year, which is very much a local tradition. And that's also on the level of popular culture.
I've lost the sound.
And those things, you know, are certainly particular to Cuba.
Yeah, that's the interesting tension. Thank you, Michael. That's the interesting tension between perhaps practices that have been preserved more en el interior, and as a result of different kind of economic motives, cattle, the cowboys, and the cosmopolitan ports, the cosmopolitan coastal areas that were not the capital, but imported another version of the capital, which was a global capital, as you say, but also had that movement of people and ideas because they were ports. It's just a really interesting configuration of lots of different things, and then how that plays out in culture, and how that plays out in terms of environmental damage. So if, for example, in the Malecón in Manzanillo, it looks exactly like that sea line. It's very eroded, there's virtually no sand, but there are the remnants of a 1950s or 1940s nightclub on the beach. It just is horrible, it's concrete, but planted in the beach, and also having contributed to the erosion. So all these sort of layers of different visions of modernity that are visible still as kind of these ghosts in the territories of those port cities is really, really fascinating. And then you have the glory of the glorietas and all of those things as well that send a certain message out about how we're cosmopolitan, how our architecture is facing the world rather than facing inland. So lots of really interesting things. It's just a lovely film. Thank you again. Any other questions? Any other comments? Please feel free.
Could I just come into you for a minute with that? Can you hear me now?
Yes, can do.
Sorry, I don't know what the sounds were, the problems were before. One of the things that we wanted with the documentary, I'm talking now from the Commodities of Empire perspective, is that it was a pilot to throw up problems that could be anywhere in the world. So not just anywhere in Cuba. And one of the lovely things is every time we've shown it, there's been some element of, I mean, like yourselves, your work in Manzanillo, which is lovely, that juxtaposition of Manzanillo, Bayamo, Caibarien, Remedios, someone said, it could be just my little town in the east of Puerto Rico, or it could be the Canaries in Spain, or it could be any seaside resort in this country, or it could be the mining communities up north. And look where they are now. I mean, we are living with the ravages, if you want, of what we have done to our world and the repercussions that that then has. And we're of a generation that we can only be deeply saddened by that. All those hopes that we had of having a better world, we seem to have created a worse world. So, we have to look for how we can begin to change that.
And it certainly looks, just to link to yesterday's discussion with Emily and Lawrence and others, it certainly looks that local responses may be sometimes the most effective responses. People who understand the territory and the damage that's been done to their surroundings and their environment and understand the historical worth of their environment in many ways might be the people who are best placed to provide some strategic responses to that issue anywhere in the world. So more questions, more comments?
I have one actually. I'm not sure which of you it's for, but just picking up on what Pa said about the local, what we know is that the new development model being encouraged in Cuba is to give the municipios greater, control or autonomy, but it could also be thrown back on their own resources. Not necessarily helpfully, but nonetheless, the local is clearly being prioritized. Do you have any idea how that is going to play out in Caibarien? It's presumably a municipio, therefore it's got it in its own right, but it doesn't, it's that issue of it doesn't necessarily have the benefit of tourism, as was made clear in the film, because it's on the periphery of the tourist development. But there might be some income there. Do you have any knowledge of what's happening with Caibarien in that sense?
Let me come in on that, because the answer that I'm going to give you is not at all what you might expect from your question. Because what we learned about Caibarien at the municipal level was quite disturbing in many ways, although we weren't surprised. And it was a disconnect, a very strong disconnect of the municipality from the provincial capital and the capital, which seriously, at one point, seriously affected what we were doing in Caibarien quite early, because this is a reflection for me also on the difference between filming in Cuba in the 1980s and even once or twice in the 90s, and then filming there now, where the kind of what you might call the infrastructure for shooting a documentary has completely changed. So there's all the bureaucracy that you would expect. And in this case, that meant that our agreement with XXIII was not just a question of access to the archive, because XXIII has to grant permission for all filming that takes place in Cuba, whether it's themselves, obviously, no problem, or anybody that they are independents. And we count it as independents because we were working with the Fundación in an open collaboration. Okay, what that meant in practice was that Ikai had to send an advice to Santa Clara, who then had to tell Cai Barrien, right? It didn't happen. On the contrary, on the third morning of filming, or the end of the second day of filming, we got back to our hostel and we were told that Inmigración wanted to see us the next morning. Not all of us. They wanted to see me and John in particular, although they knew perfectly well that Jean was producer. And the Municipalidad wanted to see us. When we got to Inmigración, we discovered they thought we were journalists. So we showed them and explained we're not journalists, we're academic filmmakers, etc., etc. And after quite careful questioning, very polite, and in the proper manner, John and me were interviewed separately. They were satisfied and said, that's okay, you can carry on. But the Municipalidad, no. They never actually gave us the formal permission. And okay, when we got back to Havana and recounted this, nobody seemed to be very worried, but we got one or two explanations. And one of the explanations was that Cai Barrien was totally pissed off with Santa Clara because Santa Clara had given all sorts of money for renovation of buildings and all that kind of stuff to Remedios, the center of which looks rather beautiful, as we get a glimpse of it in the film, and none of it went to Cai Barrien. So they were very pissed off, right? So that, on that level, the problem is not the plans, which might look splendid on paper. It is a disconnect between the center and the periphery. And of course, what I missed out in my description of what happened was that there is the parallel bureaucracy that it has to go through, which is the party itself.
Go, Jean.
Yeah, I was just putting it, yeah, I'm unmuting myself. Yeah, I mean, every time we show the film, it's like reliving all this, right? And it's lovely to watch your faces and your laughter of the sort of things that you're obviously had to go through in different ways, not filming. But of course, there's an afterlife to the documentary as well, because amongst the things that when we went back to Havana, when we got back and we said, no nos dejaron filmar lo que hicimos, we got from one source in Ikai, bueno, ¿qué esperaban? Cai Barrien es complicado. Or we also had, yes, don't you know that Villa Clara, Santa Clara and Cai Barrien are at loggerheads? Well, of course, no, we didn't know that. And maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but nobody was surprised. The other thing is that when we first showed the rough cut in Cuba, because we wanted to do it in as participatory way as we could. That didn't work out as we envisaged it, but we certainly went back with the rough cut to get everybody's responses, those that were involved in the film and those that weren't but would have liked to have been. And of course, they said it could be so many places in Cuba. You know, what you've told is a sort of microcosm of what we're facing in how we begin to move forward in this. But it is, I mean, the story in itself, when I said there's an after story to it, of course, since then, the tourism is non-existent at the moment. So this great commodity that was going to be the motor, the engine of development is no longer. And the further complication is that the municipality includes the Keys. So the municipality isn't just the city of Cai Barrien. So when you read the documents about Tarea Vida, and you know, this is going to be the flagship of the province, the flagship isn't the city. The flagship is the whole of municipality, and in reality, it's the quays and the hotels. So I've since then been doing a lot more reading of work that's been done in the university in Las Villas on the need for targeting the city as part of the tourist product. These are the people who work on tourism there. So even when tourism was it, and these studies go back to 2005. They're not new. And there's a whole team of PhD students who've done and master students who've done their theses on it. And yet nothing has happened. It's just got worse. And of course, Burma, I mean, Kate happened in '85, and since Kate and now. So it's been the issues that we were dealing with have been thrown up into relief in a way that we never foresaw when we were filming the documentary.
Thank you. That's very, very interesting. I don't want to monopolize the time. I think I could talk to both of you for ages now, but other questions, other comments from other people? Please feel free. How often do you get the filmmakers present at a film screening? Alf and Elisa.
Yes, thank you. Thanks very much for the film and all the theme that it has raised. But I was thinking about more precisely, specifically, the linking of commodities to the climate change. And I'm thinking about a book that I read a few years back. I think it was Henry Hobhouse, 5 Plants That Transform Mankind. And there he was linking plants such as quinine with the malaria, and then which made the white man had empires in Africa and then other parts of the world, and also sugar, obviously linked to the slave trade and the American South, and then tea with South Asia, China, and all that, and cotton, obviously American South as well, and then potato with the Irish famine and the British link and all that. So and how what it affected. So those are plants that transformed mankind politically and socially. So in the film, it is very interesting the idea of the coffee, how slaves went into the sugar plantation. So I'm just wondering whether linking climate change with linking commodities with climate change can also be linked with political upheaval, political transformation of Cuba. Is it because of what has happened that had created nationalism, uprising and independence, wars of independence? So can that all be linked, as in the book, how this was linked also? Thank you. Is that clear?
I guess I should come in on that as the historian, not the filmmaker. Although the challenge was then how you visualize that over time, of course. The quick answer to your question is yes. There are more and more historical studies, and I can just link it to the Caribbean, that suggest that climatic issues are at the root of many major political changes. Now, when I say at the root, I'm saying that cautiously, because how you can determine cause and effect is more problematic in history. You can look at the correlation, you can look at the links and the timing. I can just give you one example in the Cuban case, which is the 1840s in Cuba, when there were 3 major hurricanes that came through in the early 1840s, and the response of the Spanish government to the ladder conspiracy in 1844 was clearly linked to the situation that the colony was facing at that point in time. So, I mean, there are historians like Stuart Schwartz, who's done his work on the whole of the Caribbean, who, like Sherry Johnson, who's in the documentary, has done it on Cuba. who suggests that those sorts of events could be seen as more important than diplomacy, than wars, than because they really reconfigure not only the landscape, the natural landscape, they reconfigure the social and the cultural and the political landscape.
Excellent, fascinating discussion.
Thank you very much.
Yes, you've got your hand up as well, Elisa. Please go ahead.
Yeah.
Can you make it visible so we can see your face? It's a little bit easier to
Okay.
communicate like that.
Can you see me?
Yes.
We can hear you perfectly and we can see you. Fantastic.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for the documentary. I found it extremely interesting. The way you link Cuba's history, economy, agriculture, dependency and resistance to external and internal shocks. I think it is amazing. Thanks a lot. I also like the idea of local and sustainable agriculture. And I think that today, in the current context of the COVID pandemic, is where we have to place this type of local alternatives. And I think it is quite interesting as well, the quote by my friend Fernando Funes Monzote, when he say, and I'm going to quote it in Spanish, enfrentamos un bloqueo a nivel mundial, el mundo vive un periodo especial. This is something I already told them a couple of months ago when we were talking about the pandemic and the impact on Spain and Cuba. And I think it is quite interesting, although you filmed the documentary in 2019, I think it is extremely interesting, this quote. I just wanted to highlight these aspects, and thank you very much for the documentary. It's excellent. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Elisa.
Thank you. Anybody else with any questions or any comments? We've got another 10 minutes and then we'll have a break before we start. Marisa, your arms might be getting a little tired, so you may want to put your hand down. And Elisa also, you may want to put your hand down. Unless you have another comment. Anybody else?
Can I just come in about COVID, which really is a response saying the thing, I mean, the very origins of COVID are what we've done to the environment. I mean, quite clearly, the whole thing about pathogens going from animals to humans is linked to the ways in which we have invaded and destroyed their territories. So, I mean, I'm going now into the medical side, but one of the interesting things that's come out of Cuba from the environmentalists is they are making that link, and they are trying to make that argument, saying that the health situation we're facing is a product of, right? The fact that Cuba has such a high level of diabetes is a product of sugar. It's the monoculture that they've had, and the fact that's been used, and the this, that, and the other. That pork is the national dish. You know, I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which health history is related to environmental history, is related to the economic history, and the big fear I think we all have is whether we come out of COVID with more of the same or worse of the same, or whether it can be the trigger to change. And unfortunately, I mean, to go back to something Emily said yesterday, and which the economists are saying, to making change in bad situations is not easy. But maybe it's the only one. It has to be the bad situation that pushes you into that. And who knows?
Thanks, Jean. Anybody else with a question or a comment? one of the things that occurred to me, since I'm jumping in there, is to say since the whole emphasis was the relationship between climate change, environment, economic development, political structures, and so on, I was reminded when I was watching the film of the Lou Perez book on hurricanes, and his argument that, in fact, a series of hurricanes at a particular time changed the economy of Cuba quite significantly, not least by destroying coffee plantations, for example, and that sort of thing. And out of which came, of course, weirdly, the business that Cuba suddenly had the right crop for the right time and the right market. It's a comment that reinforces, or not comment, it's a perspective that reinforces the point that your film was clearly making, which is, who would have predicted that? Who would have predicted that a series of hurricanes would have transformed, or at least contributed to a transformation of the future of Cuba? It's no more than that, unless you've got a comment, but I've noticed there is one other question coming up there. So shall I move straight away to you, Jackie? Where are you, Jackie? You put your hand up. Okay.
Yes. It's Ari here. It's Ari here.
Hello, Aris.
Hello. Bueno, el comentario que quiero traer es, en primer lugar, agradecer a estos realizadores y a todas las personas que tuvieron que ver con este material, y lo hago en mi nombre personal y en nombre de todo el pueblo cubano, en nombre de toda la nacionalidad cubana, porque este material trae a clarificar, a conocer, por todos aquellos que tengan el alcance o la posibilidad de verlo, una historia, una versión muy actualizada y verdadera de Cuba. Agradezco infinitamente el trabajo de todas estas personas. Pero además quiero decir que luego de tener esta valiosa joya, ahora la segunda parte es no menos importante. Yo creo que este documental es digno de que sea estudiado o expuesto en todas las universidades de Reino Unido, incluso de Europa, un poco más allá, y que también esté al alcance de diferentes grupos sociales, personas interesadas en hacer turismo en Cuba, y para todos en general. Sabemos que los medios de comunicación no se van a encargar de eso, pues le pido de todo corazón a estos realizadores, a estas personas, que aborden una segunda fase de mover esto a través de las universidades y de cuantos grupos sociales sea posible. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a usted. Una de las ideas fue precisamente la idea de hacer llegar el documental a las instituciones educacionales, etcétera, etcétera. Y por eso también la estructura es en 3 partes. Y las 3 partes se puede ver y utilizar individualmente, precisamente para dar esta posibilidad mejor, parte discusión. Y el sitio web también tiene mucho material de background, de información, para apoyar la utilización de la película. Gracias.
Muy bien, gracias. Bueno, gracias. ¿Alguna pregunta más? ¿Algún comentario más? yo creo que ya vamos a hacer un pequeño descanso. We'll have a quick break until 1